Isn't it grand to be a Christian? Isn't it grand and wonderful to be here at the Concord Street congregation? I'm so glad that you are here. We have several visitors that are with us, and we're very, very glad that you are here too, whether you are from the area or from out of town. We are glad that you came to be with us this morning and have had the opportunity to worship with us. And we want you to know you're an honored guest, and please come back each and every time that you have opportunity. And if you are from the local area and looking for a church home, we'd love to talk to you about that and love for you to be a part of our family that meets here. I appreciate the fine job that Ben has done in leading our singing and all of you and being with us in this worship service, and appreciate the words of Wesley as we gather around the Lord's table. Just a wonderful, wonderful time for us to be together. There's a couple housekeeping notes I want to mention before I get into the sermon this morning. Make sure you get a copy of the bulletin. It is full of all kinds of things that are coming up. I'm not going to read all the details about it because I believe you can read for yourself. But there is a Sunshine Street event. There's some ladies events. There's the Marriage Book Club meeting today. There's a 39ers event. In other words, if you're looking for something to do this month, there is something for you. And so make sure you get a copy of the bulletin. We have these physical copies, and also if you're a member here, then you probably got one in your email on Friday too. And then one other housekeeping note is that tonight we'll be doing a deep dive of Mark 13. So if you have any questions about Mark 13 that you want answered, if you want to email me this afternoon so I can have a little bit of heads up for it, that is great. If not, we're going to go through Mark 13 a little bit more in depth than we did last Sunday morning. And then if you have a sermon series, a topic, or something along those lines that you would like to have covered from the pulpit for next year, I am in the process of planning out my sermons for next year. And so if you have a book or a topic or a theme or something that you want touched on, then I will at least listen to what you have to say. And then I will decide whether that will fit into the schedule or not. But don't just tell me after services. Please email me or write me so I can have a copy of that and I can look back at it as I am making those notes. Turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. We are coming to the end of Jesus' life. We have had the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. He has been going back and forth from Jerusalem to Bethany, from Bethany to Jerusalem. He's been going to the temple. He had just declared the doom of the temple in Mark chapter 13. And now we are here in Mark chapter 14. And the first thing I want you to notice is that in Mark 14, we have one of those Markan sandwiches that we've been talking about as we've gone through the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 14, verses 1 and 2 is the first piece of bread. Mark chapter 14, verses 10 and 11 is the second piece of bread. And Mark 3 through 9 is the meat of the sandwich in between. And remember, Mark does this. This is a literary tactic that he used to try to show, to compare or contrast, or to try to teach a deeper point. And so what we're going to see here is that Mark is contrasting the chief priest and the scribes with this woman, as we mentioned in verses 3 through 9, with Judas that is mentioned in verses 10 and 11. So the ends of the sandwich are showing you, do not be like this. And the middle of the sandwich is showing you who you should be like. But let's notice some of these things. So just keep that in mind as we're going to read this entire text again, just for emphasis' sake. Starting in Mark chapter 14 and in... we'll start in verse 3. I missed the first two verses there. And being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came having an alabaster flask of very costly oil of spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it on his head. But there were some who were indignant among themselves and said, "Why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they criticized her sharply. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do good to them. But me you do not have always. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Assuredly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. What I want you to notice is this great extravagance that this woman goes through for Jesus. Now, it is interesting, as you looked at this text, and I didn't have verses 1 and 2 and 10 and 11 up there, but there's different people that you can be. And that's the first question we want to ask. Who am I in this story? Okay, which character am I? And here's your options that you can be. You can be like the chief priest and the scribes. You can be like Judas. You can be like the criticizing disciples. Or you can be like this unnamed female disciple that is in the text. Now, I think it's interesting that Mark does not give this woman a name. He keeps her nameless. He keeps it almost maybe a little bit of mystery about her, about who she could be. Now, you can read the other accounts in Matthew and also John, and we'll come to understand who she is, and we'll look at that in a moment. But this morning, as you read this text, you are one of these four individuals. So let's think about them individually. Okay? Maybe you are the chief priest and the scribes. You know, they wanted to destroy Jesus. They were actively seeking his death. They were people who were planning and plotting and wanting Jesus to die. And when you look at this text, more than likely, if you are here this morning, that's not you. And that's not me. I don't find myself in that section. Well, maybe I might be Judas. Judas was the betrayer. But it's also interesting about Judas is Judas is one of the disciples. He walked around with Jesus. He heard Jesus' teaching. He was a follower of Jesus. Judas was one that had a relationship with Jesus. So much of a relationship with Jesus that in a few more later on in these verses, we'll find out that Judas feels comfortable enough to come up and to give Jesus a kiss in the garden. They have a relationship. They are friends, if you will. But Judas chose an easier way. So much of Jesus' teaching was talking about taking up the cross and following me. So much of Jesus' teaching had to do with suffering, had to do with doing it the hard way, if you will, and following after Jesus. But Satan had come into Judas' life and had given him an easier way, and Judas chose that easier way. He chose the things of this world and 30 pieces of silver to find that easier way. So who am I? Am I Judas? Well, could this be me? Well, perhaps sometimes. Sometimes I can be Judas and choose an easier way and therefore betray my Lord. Or maybe you can be in the text and you might be like the disciples. These criticizing disciples, they were critical of this woman's devotion. They were people that are characterized, at least in this text, as being indignant, being judgmental, being criticizing and harsh. They were focused on the negative. They didn't focus on the great thing this woman did. They focused on that she wasted money, that she could have done something else. They were extremely harsh with this woman. Could this be me? Well, perhaps sometimes. Sadly, it is. Sadly, we as Christians can look at things the wrong way and think if somebody is not doing it the way I want them to do it, then perhaps they are doing it wrong. And that's what we see this woman is having to experience. But also, when you think about this text, you could also be that unnamed female disciple and her extravagant devotion to Jesus. Notice what she does. She is wholly focused on Jesus, wholly focused on her Messiah. This is one that, unlike Judas, who is a disciple in name, Judas, who is a disciple in words perhaps, this woman is not just mere words, but is sacrificial in her action. She is spending an amazing amount of money on Jesus right here. 300 denarii. Basically, that is an entire year's wage spent in just a few moments. But it is spent on Jesus. She has great extravagance. And what the text is trying to point out is that this needs to be me. I need to be like this disciple. I need to be like this woman. Don't be like the other disciples that are used in contrast, but instead be like this woman. But here's another question I want us to look at. I want us to think about the question that is brought up in the text by the disciples. Why was this fragrant oil wasted? Think about that for a moment. About the idea of something being a waste. Now, I try to be a frugal person. I try to be somebody that is not just going to waste things. You know, as a father, one of my jobs, this is an inherent job of a father, is that food cannot be wasted at dinner, right? We do not want it to be wasted. Either it was purchased or it was made, and we want to make sure that that's not going to go to waste because we don't like wasting things. Well, here this woman is asked in front of all the disciples is, why was this fragrant oil wasted? And it brings me to this question. Was Jesus worth it? Or is Jesus worth it to this woman? It's interesting in the text we find out that this woman uses the whole bottle on Jesus. Here we have from other texts we find out that it's basically a pound of spikenard, this pound of this fragrant oil, of this perfume. And usually there's a little stopper that is in the top of the flask. And what would be done, this is done many, many times in this culture, a way that you honor somebody is that you would anoint them with this oil. But usually the stopper is removed and just all you need, just a little bit will do, right? A little bit will go a long way, and just pour just a little bit and anoint the person on the head. And it's kind of like a fragrant aroma. It's a sign of special thanks and all of those things. But notice, this woman does not do that. She does not take the stopper out carefully and pour a little bit on Jesus' head. She breaks the entire bottle, the entire pound, the whole amount. Other texts tell us that the fragrance basically filled the entire room. She pours it all on him. Which asks the question, is Jesus worth it? Well, maybe he's worth just a little bit, but to this woman, Jesus is worth the entire bottle. Not just a little bit, but the entire thing. But also you think about this. Was Jesus worth the great expense? We find out from this text and from others that basically the value of this bottle was at least 300 denarii. If you take out the 52 Sabbaths and you take out the so many odd feast days and such, you get basically 300 working days every single year. This woman at least spent her entire year's salary just in one moment. And for us, we're looking at this from a financial standpoint, right? Looking at this from a frugal standpoint, we might look at her and criticize her also and say, you realize that was kind of wasteful. I mean, did you have to spend it all right then? Did you have to use it all right then? Was Jesus worth it? But think about what Jesus is to this woman. We find from John's account that the woman that does this is Mary, the sister of Lazarus. Now, is Jesus worth it to Mary? This Mary who she saw her brother dead. She buried her brother. She wept over her brother. But then Jesus came in and he said, Lazarus, come forth, and Lazarus raised from the dead. Is Jesus worth it to this woman? Most certainly she is worth it. Jesus is worth the expense. Jesus is worth the extravagance because of what Jesus means to this woman. Now, there's many times when I'm dealing with my kids and they'll ask for something or they'll want something, and I am very, very quickly tell them no. No, you don't need that. No, we don't want that. No, we don't need to buy that. No, you don't need that. But, not that they're not worth it, but they're not really that worth it, okay? They're kids. One day they'll get to decide what something is worth. But on the other hand, if my wife wants something, she's worth it. All right? And I tell them all the time, all right, well, you don't get that, but what if mom wants it? Then y'all can have it. Right? Because she's worth it. Jesus realizes that, this woman realizes that Jesus is worth it. Which brings about the question to us. Is Jesus worth it to me? Maybe sometimes the reason why I am not the disciple that I need to be, maybe sometimes the reason why I don't live the life that I'm supposed to live, or I don't do the service that I'm supposed to do, or all of those things, maybe it's because I don't realize how worth it Jesus is. Is Jesus worth the sacrifice? If you are following Jesus, if you are a Christian and claim to be His disciple, and you are not sacrificing something, you're not His disciple. Disciples sacrifice. Is He worth it? Is He worth my money? Now, we had the conversation just a few moments ago about, and we had the time for the offering and all of those things. And this is not one of those places that is always asking for your money. It's so funny to me sometimes in denominationalism that they won't take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, but they sure ask you to pass the plate every single time you're there, right? And so it's like, that seems kind of weird. But one thing that I do want us to think about is, does my giving show that Jesus is worth it? Or does my giving show that I have a lot more control over things than I'm giving it to the Lord? So a new year is coming upon us very, very soon. Challenge yourself. Is my giving showing that Jesus is worth it? Or is it showing that perhaps I'm focused on more things of this world, just like Judas was focused on? What about, is Jesus worth my time? There is all kinds of things that take up our time during the day. All kinds of things that take up our time during the week. And I realize we have to triage, we have to make decisions about whether doing this or doing that. But we have got to get out of the habit of thinking that just 1 hour on Sunday morning, that's the Lord's time. My time is the Lord's. He's worth it. He is definitely worth it. Is He worth my life? Think about that for a moment. You have this woman simply because, and I say simply trying to make a comparison here, but simply because Jesus raised her brother from the dead, she considers him worth the entire bottle. She considers him worth the 300 denarii. What has He done for you? No, He hasn't raised your brother from the dead, but He has provided salvation for your soul. And when I think about His cost on the cross, when I think about what He has done for me, then it should really be a no-brainer. Should I spend this time? Should I spend this money? Should I have this sacrifice? Should I give my life to this man? Yes, He is worth it. He is worth every single bit of it. He is worth the extravagance. Now, when you start being extravagant for Christ, I can promise you one thing. Just like this happens to this woman, there's going to be people that are going to criticize you. There's going to be people who may look at you and like, are you one of those, crazy Christians? Right? Because we have different levels of Christianity, right? You have and that's sad, right? That we have some people that are Christians, but they're kind of like your Sunday morning sometime Christians, right? And then you have some of those people who are crazy, who people will criticize, who don't use language like the rest of the world, who just because they're not inside the buildings of a church building, they act a different way. There's people that if there's something that's been going on with their congregation, they're going to try to find a way to be about it. There's people that if there's a need, they're going to try to fulfill it. And the world's going to look around at you and say, isn't that just a little much? But is it too much when it comes to what the Lord has done for me? He is worth it. He is worth every bit of your extravagance. One of the songs that Ben led for us just a moment ago before the Lord's Supper, talking about how that He gave all of this for me. What have I given to Him? Be extravagant for Christ. Now, we've talked about who we are in the story. We want to be like this woman. We've talked about this question about whether Jesus is worth it or not. But here's one other thing that I find very, very interesting in the text, and this is something I've never seen before, but as I was studying it this week, it has kind of like popped out at me, and I want to share it with you too. I think it's interesting that to ask the question, well, what am I worth? In our text, notice that it's very clear that it said the woman took the alabaster flask, that she broke it and poured it on Jesus. And in doing that, in taking it and breaking it and pouring it, she is showing how much Jesus is worth. That not just a little bit, but that entire flask, it is worthless now. It's not like she can take it and go, oh, well, I didn't mean to spend that much and try to put some back in there. No, it was all poured out. She broke it and poured. And that this was going to be said as a memorial to her whenever the gospel is preached. Now notice this. Isn't it interesting that just a few verses later that Jesus talks about the same thing in a memorial? Notice what He says. This is in Mark's account. Mark chapter 14, verses 22 through 24. And as they were eating, Jesus took the bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then He took the cup, and when He had given thanks, He gave it to them, and they all drank. And He said, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed." But that word there in the Greek is cheo, which is the same exact word that is used for pour earlier in the text, which is poured out for many. Do you see what perhaps Mark is showing us here? Is that this woman is giving a precursor, a picture, a preview, if you will, of exactly what Jesus is going to do for us. Jesus' body, being that alabaster flask of His body was broken. His body was beat. And I now realize that none of His bones were broken, but His flesh was broken. It was whipped. It was beat. It was hung upon a cross. And when that body was broken, guess what came out? Came out that blood. And that blood poured out. And it wasn't just a little bit of His blood, if you will. He gave His entire life on that cross. And we partake of the Lord's Supper, as we did, as a memorial to that breaking and that pouring. This woman's story about her breaking the flask and it being poured on Jesus was supposed to be a memorial to her whenever the gospel is preached. So it brings me back to this question. What am I worth? We deal, in this world we live in today, there's a lot of people that struggle with this idea of not being worthy of the different type of things that we have to have, right? We have to have a sense of belonging. We have to have the sense like that we are loved. We want to have acceptance. And we see people all the time. We see our young people especially going out and doing different things in hopes that they will be accepted. There are people who perhaps are here this morning who are struggling with the idea of whether I am worthy or not. Well, remember that this woman, she thought Jesus worthy enough to break and to pour. What about you? What's your value? What is your worth? Now, I'm not talking about the value that some other human puts upon you. I'm not talking about the value that the government may put upon you. I'm not talking about the value that maybe some friends or even family or even parents that you have perceived have put upon you. But how valuable are you to the Lord? How valuable are you to Christ? Well, this woman thought Jesus was valuable enough to spend the entire flask, to break it and to pour it. Well, Jesus does the very same thing for each and every one of you. He breaks His body and pours out His blood for you. Turn your Bibles real quick as we close over to 1 Peter and in chapter 1. 1 Peter and in chapter 1. Now remember, this book is being written by Peter the Apostle, a guy that knows a thing or two because he's seen a thing or two, right? He was there. He walked around with Jesus. He was there. He knows what took place on the cross. He sat there around the table that we just read about when the Lord's Supper was instituted. He was there in the upper room that saw the Lord gird Himself and start washing the disciples' feet. You know, He was there for a lot of these things. He was also there to deny Jesus, right? But notice what he says in talking to other Christians, Christians that are going through persecution, Christians who are going through hardship simply because they are a Christian, Christians that may be asking the question, well, what am I worth? Is this all worth it? Is it worth my life? Is it worth going through the sacrifice? Is it worth doing all of these things? Am I that valuable? Notice what he says, starting in chapter 1 and in verse 18. He says, knowing that you were not redeemed, you were not bought back, you were not purchased. Your value was not with corruptible things, like silver or gold from the aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers. And that's when we think of something of value, we think silver and gold really kind of shows how valuable something is, right? If you're going to spend the money, then that obviously must have been valuable. But he says that you were not redeemed by the silver and gold, which is corruptible, which will fade away, which will go away, which where thieves will break in and steal, where moth does rust and destroy, right? You are not redeemed by those things. But look what he goes on to say in verse 19. But with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish and without spot. Guess what you were purchased with? Not with all the riches in the world, not with all the thousands and millions and billions of dollars, but when Jesus saw you and He saw your life, even your sinful life, and He saw you in your disobedience, when He saw you in your sin and you on your way to a devil's hell, He looked at each and every one of you and said, how much is that individual worth? He's worth me breaking the entire body and pouring all of my blood. How much is that individual worth? He's not worth all the riches in the world, but he's worth the precious blood of Jesus Christ, that Lamb without spot and without blemish. If you don't learn anything else from this morning, learn this. You are valuable. Not because I said you were valuable, but because there was a cross that shows you that you are valuable. Am I worth it? Jesus says, you are worth it. Now, how will I respond to that? That's the thing about the cross, is that every single time you walk up to the foot of the cross, you have to make a decision. When you stand at the foot of the cross and you look up at it and you see that man hanging there in agony and in pain, when you see the blood coming from his hands and coming from his head and coming from his feet, when you see him up there crying out to his God, delivering those psalms like Psalm 22 and the other psalms that he says from the cross, when you see that man up there, you are left with a decision. Either I'm going to look at that cross and say, thanks, but I'll go my own way. Or you can look at that cross, and that cross can fundamentally change you forever. Because on the cross, he says, David, you are worth it. David, I die for you. Now, am I worth it for you to live for me? That's the question. That's what we're stuck with. We can look at the cross and we can wag our heads and walk away and think, what a waste. Did he really need to die? Was that what needed to happen? Or we can look at the cross and be amazed by the grace and the love of God, and therefore want to die with him. This entire year, I've been looking at the idea of being cruciformed, of that passage from Mark chapter 8. It's been up on the wall all year long. If you haven't seen it yet, then maybe you want to look at it, okay? It's there. It's the idea that if you want to be a follower of Jesus, then you have to follow him to the cross. The way that it was said by Dietrich Bonhoeffer years and years ago, he said, when Jesus calls a man, he bids him to come and die. That's what we're asking for this morning. And I can promise you this, it's worth it. He's worth it. The Christian life is not going to be one of fame and fortune necessarily. You may not have all of the riches or all the blessings of people living out in the world, but you have the Lord who has died for you, and so therefore it is worth it for you to live for him. But you can't live for him until you die with him. And you die with him by saying, I no longer want to live my life the way I want to live it. I want to live my life the way my Lord wants me to live it. I kill that old man of sin. As Paul would say, I crucify myself with Christ. I bury myself, again as Paul would say, I've been buried with him in his death in baptism. And then I rise to walk in newness of life. Who are you this morning? The chief priests and scribes that want to kill him? Judas that wants to betray him? The disciples that want to look at everybody else and criticize them, not think about themselves? Or are you like that unnamed female disciple who is willing to be extravagant for Christ? She asked the question, is Jesus worth it? Most certainly he is worth this alabaster flask and all the other alabaster flasks I can get my hands on it. But then he looks at you and you ask the question, am I worth it? And he has the cross to say, yes, you are worth it. Come die with me so you can live with me. Is there anyone who can help you this morning? Please come as we stand and sing.